Jesus has been asked in the Good Samaritan story that Marilyn just read to us, who is my neighbor? And the obvious answer should be, well, whoever lives next door. Ne means near, so it must be whoever lives next door to me, or at least nearby. But Jesus answers that simple question with a parable, and not a definition. Jesus uses a lot of parables, and when he does this, they become famous for their vivid imagery and situations, the prodigal son, the woman with the lost coin. But the reason Jesus speaks in parables is because he wants to shift the conversation beyond the obvious. He wants to help people think outside the box, and that's what he does here. Jesus tells us of a man who's been walking along the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. This road is like a pedestrian highway. No one had cars back then, of course, and even horses were rare, so it was mostly people walking along. And we can tell that it's not in the middle of a village because robbers have come to mug this poor man, which means that they're not worried about being seen by anybody else. So to answer the question of who is my neighbor, Jesus has chosen a place that doesn't have any neighbors. So whatever neighbor means to Jesus, it's not the literal meaning of the word neighbor. The next shift happens when people walk by the man who's bleeding on the road. He's been left for dead. We're told that two men walk by. One's a priest and one a Levite. The priest works in the temple. The Levite is of the clan that goes all the way back to Moses' brother, the first priest. Both of them know that they should stop. That's just basic Jewish law, but they don't. They just cross the road to the other side and keep going. Why? Well, some people have speculated that maybe the priest and the Levite didn't want to become ritually impure by touching a man's blood. But Jewish commentators have said, no, that's impossible. First of all, they had a duty to help the man. And secondly, it was easy to become ritually impure. You did that by having sex or even going to the bathroom. Cleaning up was just part of the job. So were these men just scared of the situation? Were they disgusted by the man lying on the side of the road? We don't know. What we do know is that they crossed to the side of the road, and that one other man does choose to help. But for the people who heard this story originally, he's the last person you'd expect to help a poor Jewish man lying bleeding on the road. He's a Samaritan. Samaritans come from a region next door to Judea. From a Jewish point of view, they're kind of like lapsed Jews. They only believe in they only read the first 5 books of the Torah. They don't read the rest. They don't read the prophecies. They don't worship in the temple. They're kind of like lapsed Jews, and they're despised for that. And yet, this Samaritan, when he's walking by, he knew no one else is around. He could have just kept walking. No one would ever know. And yet, he stays. And the fact that it's a Samaritan who's the one who provides the help is meant to be a challenge or insult to the Jews who are listening to Christ's story. Jesus appears to be saying it's not enough to know the rules and the theory of your faith, its rituals. What really matters is what you do when nobody's looking. What really matters is when you don't have any guidance, when you're just stuck on an empty road with a situation you hadn't anticipated. This is applied faith. What will you do when there's no one around to define who is your neighbor? Will you help? Lately, there have been a lot of people crossing to the other side of the road, both figuratively and literally, in Midtown Toronto. A homeless shelter opened up on Mount Pleasant Boulevard in July, and it's brought a population of very visible drug addicts into the neighborhood. It's called the Roehampton Hotel Shelter because it's taken up residence in what used to be the Roehampton Hotel. It's very close to Yonge and Eglinton. It's also very close to 2 schools. Upset citizens have been using social media to upload pictures of drug users shooting up in alleyways, on roads, in stairwell of nearby buildings. And local residents have been outraged by the sudden appearance of needles in the park, which have definitely been happening, and schoolyards. There have been protests and petitions demanding that drug addicts be removed from the neighborhood, that the shelter clean up its act. The situation has revealed that Midtown Toronto is kind of like a gated community with an invisible wall. And that wall is made of real estate prices and mortgage prices. And it's kept the poor from staying. But now, thanks to the pandemic, when suddenly we needed many more shelters, the poor have been catapulted over that invisible wall into Midtown Toronto. And people are upset. I went to one of those neighborhood protests. This is back in late August. I came to support the rights of the homeless, and I wore my clerical collar, which I don't usually do. But I wanted to hear both sides of the story, so I crossed the line and I spoke to several of the residents who were protesting against the shelter. They held signs saying things like, "Shelters, yes, but crime, no." One of the people I spoke to was a man a bit older than me. He told me he was glad every time one of the drug users overdosed and died. Those recreational drug users, he told me, get what they deserve, and then they have no right living on the public dime. He even told me, keep in mind I'm wearing a collar at this point, he even told me that he would feel the same way even if it was his own son. Now, not everyone in the neighborhood feels this way. I think this was an extreme case. There's people who are very supportive of the shelters, people who are supportive and concerned, and people who just wish the shelter could go away. The neighborhood runs the full gamut. But that man's comment really stuck with me. I came away from the protest realizing that I didn't really know very much about drug addiction among homeless people. How does a person get to the point where they're homeless and drug addicted, scoring their drugs outside? So I decided to ask people who do know about these things. I got in touch with the shelter and I said, could they introduce me to some frontline workers who have regular contact with homeless people who have addiction issues? And they did. And I also spoke to people within the church who had either been addicted or knew people who were addicted, and they put me on to some readings. So I'd like to share what these people have been telling me about this situation with you today. The first thing I was told is that in the vast majority of people who are addicted and homeless, they suffer from trauma. The trauma can be psychological, physical, and often both. Many of these people come from homes where they suffered emotional or physical abuse, either at the hand of their parents or from others. Trauma can be caused by even just witnessing abuse. If you see your father beating your mother, even if your father never lays a hand on you, that can be traumatic enough to give you post-traumatic stress disorder. And this kind of trauma happens in homes of every income level. Nice big homes in North Toronto contain kids who are abused and traumatized. And of course, the parents are in no rush to send their kids to therapy because the dark secret of the family might come out. So trauma has a way of getting hidden. 63% of homeless youth are from families where they suffered neglect and abuse. Kids who run away from these houses hit the streets hurt, homeless, and untreated. And often, that trauma doesn't go away. A recent study by Queen's University in Kingston found that 87% of homeless adults with addiction issues suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. 99% had experienced physical, emotional, or sexual abuse as a child. So, as in our Good Samaritan story, these people by the side of the road have probably been beaten, physically, emotionally, or both, at some point in their lives. But why are they sitting there with a needle in their hands, taking heroin? Frontline workers told me that trauma is common among homeless people addicted to heroin, and that trauma hurts. People with severe PTSD don't feel normal, they feel numb, moment to moment. However, when they ingest opiates like heroin or oxycodone, the haze lifts. They can feel good for a little while. Users call it a warm hug. But then, in a terrible trade-off, their brain chemistry works against them. They experience the symptoms of what's called dope sick. It's a feeling of withdrawal, which can kick in within minutes of shooting up and the high wearing off. Multiple people told me that dope sick is like having the flu, except 100 times worse. And the severity of the dope sickness builds hour by hour after the high wears off. So you're just desperate to get your next fix so that feeling can go away again for a while. Dr. Bonnie Henry is the Chief Medical Officer of British Columbia. You've probably heard her name, at least in part because of the COVID-19 crisis in Canada. She also has a lot of experience with the heroin epidemic in BC. And she says, and I quote, "Most people, when they're addicted to heroin or fentanyl or whatever, they don't actually get high anymore. It's all about trying to stave off those feelings of being dope sick. The withdrawal from it is quite horrendous. Makes you feel really bad. So you need more and more just to feel normal again. Opioids change your brain, and it resets your normal level, if you will." So that person in the alleyway has not just been beaten up by trauma, but they're being abused by the drug that promised to make them feel better. These people did not start using heroin for recreation, and they're not recreational drug users now. They're fighting for survival against a sickness, which is like a form of slavery. Frontline workers told me that they'd met lots and lots of homeless people who were addicted from wealthy homes. They got addicted when they were paying mortgages and holding down jobs. Heroin addiction isn't just for people who are down and out already. You've heard about the opiate crisis, of course. About 1 in 6 people in Canada are currently on prescription opiates supplied by their doctor, perfectly legal. Opiates are designed to relieve physical pain. They're prescribed after surgeries, for cancer patients, and for pain from back and muscle issues. Most of us can get a prescription of oxycodone after our surgery, take the pills for a few days, and we're fine. Problem solved. However, for a small proportion of the population, around 2%, pre-existing conditions like trauma and even genetics can make those same drugs highly addictive. Trauma in particular sets people up for drug addiction. But if you don't realize that you're suffering from PTSD and your doctor doesn't know, you can fall down this rabbit hole quickly. Why couldn't the addicts just shoot up in their rooms? They are allowed to by the shelter. I was told that dope sickness makes people feel so awful that as soon as they get their drugs from their dealer, they want to shoot up right away. And so they'll shoot up outside in desperation to stop feeling like that. And unfortunately, the drug supply in the last few years has been poisoned by a new opiate called fentanyl, which is synthetic. And it's 30 to 50 times stronger than heroin. This has resulted in an epidemic of overdoses in Canada and the United States. But what it means is when people shoot up in a rush, they often lose consciousness. And that's another reason that people end up doing it outside. The fentanyl is so deadly that people would like to shoot up with a friend nearby. So they get the drugs, they sit down with a friend, and they shoot up, and they hope that this time they won't die from the drug which is supposed to help them feel normal for a few minutes or a few hours. So that man or woman who you see slumped over in the alleyway or the stairwell likely has a tragic story that landed them there. They are desperately sick people, and our citizens have not rushed to their care. They've been beaten up by life, and most of us have left them suffering on the street. Some of us have even demanded that they be removed from the neighborhood altogether. We have crossed the road to the other side. If there's a good Samaritan in this real-life story, it's the city. They were the ones who scooped up many of these people from the encampments and brought them to the shelters near Yonge and Eglinton. They know everything that I've told you today. This is a reality they live with all the time. To them, these homeless people with addiction issues are taxpayers, just like you and I. Every time they go into a store and buy cigarettes or food or whatever, they're paying sales tax. They pay tax on their welfare checks or their ODSP. And because many of them don't have a fixed address, they may never file a tax return, so they don't even get the rebates which they deserve. Their traumas often began when they were innocent children, or when they were injured on the job. So like the Good Samaritan, the city picked them up and brought them to an inn. The city is paying their bills, hoping that they'll get better. Inside the shelter, there's now programs for finding employment. There's access to psychiatrists, doctors, and nurses. But the resources that they need to get off heroin in this city are spotty and inconsistent. It costs money to put people through rehab properly, and our society isn't willing to pay the bill. Championing the rights of heroin addicts is not an obvious campaign platform for politicians. And they know that this neighborhood wished this shelter had never even arrived. And many in this neighborhood have asked that the city at least prevent the drug addicts from living in the shelter. But that isn't going to happen. The city knows that we owe it to people to help them. They've been beaten up enough already. When Christ asked, "Who is my neighbor?" when he was asked that question, he responded with a story about 4 men on an empty road. None of them were neighbors. The man who was lying at the side of the road, wounded, had been attacked by robbers. So that means that same fate could have happened to any one of those men. Christ's parable is saying, this beaten man could be you. You were fortunate enough to end up not on the ground. And so you have a choice. You can be disgusted, walk on by, or you can stop to help. God's love flowed through that Good Samaritan. He didn't care about postal codes or ethnicity. He just wanted to help someone who he saw was in need. The homeless person with the needle in their hand could easily be you or someone that you love. If you think about your extended family and friend network, you'll probably find someone like this. They're often the people that we stop talking about, who kind of disappear. It's easy to end up in that alleyway, easier than you think. These addicts are desperate and they need help. They need a safe drug supply that won't kill them. And they need safe places to take their drugs until they can get help to be housed and go through detox. None of that will be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. But in this parable, Christ isn't asking us to do anything easy. Now that the city has taken these people to the inn, the question is whether this neighborhood will help the residents to heal. As one source put it, the opposite of addiction is connection. Connection to other people who want to help. Drop-in centers, buddy systems, TTC fairs so that people can actually get to their doctor's appointments on time. There are lots of ways that the community can help. But it starts with seeing these people not as a them, but as us. Then we can cross the road and offer some help. Then we'll really be acting like neighbors. Amen.